So from the dry stone wall project I managed to get the correct foam this time, which is what I wanted for in the first place, which is called XPS foam, which is an extruded foam. You can actually push into it and it will stay in that shape. You can snap it. The foam I was sent last time was actually a kind of squishy foam for actually upholstery, which is not the type of foam I thought I was buying. So from a little bit of research online, I found out that for a scale model it's usually a brick. For a brick wall would be 3mm by 8, and the actual line spacing is an actual millimetre of that, so they become like 2 by 7. Whether that's correct, I hope that's right, but so I drew it out, made some slight line mistakes, but I was practicing, learning how to do it, and I then decided to, if I mark the top row of bricks using something that's about 1 millimetre wide, which actually is a metal nail file, then I could do the top row and then just copy that down freehand, which in theory should work. I was quite surprised at first when I first started doing it at how small the bricks looked. They didn't look very correct to me, but I went with it because that's what I'd read is the proper scale size. And I switched to a knife blade because it was easier to see what I was doing, and I could always go over the line with something else a little later to deepen it and widen it. I was just marking foam at this point where I thought each brick should go. And even though I was being very careful and trying to measure everything and get it right, I still ended up with some very oddly shaped bricks. So if I do this project again, which I intend to do with a more complicated wall, this is just a bare plain brick wall. Whereas if I do it again, I'd like to do an archway or a door or a window in the wall, so it's a more complicated design. But I just wanted to test the concept, see if I could do it with just basic materials and cheap acrylic paints, nothing professional, nothing expensive. The most expensive part was the foam piece. I ordered mine off of Amazon, XPS foam. You may be able to get some if you have a arts and crafts store, or even a store that does any kind of construction materials may have it. Probably in much bigger blocks though, so I was pleased I bought it how I did, in sheets like this, because that means I have one spare sheet to make something else later, and I could see if it was what I actually intended, what I wanted. So at the moment I'm just widening and deepening some of the lines, which will be the spaces between each brick. Once I'd marked everything out, it actually became a lot easier and more fun to do, but at first it was quite confusing trying to get the line spacing right and not being able to see where you were cutting, because the thickness of the tool was actually in your way of your view. So I tried all sorts of methods. I tried credit card in the gap to make those gaps bigger and the right thickness. I tried different tools. The nail file proved pretty much the easiest one. So I decided not to measure them all. I would just copy every second row and just copy that line down. I think this is where the variation came in, and some bricks did end up weird sizes at the end, but it wasn't that noticeable once it was finished that some bricks weren't exactly the right size. It's a painstakingly long-winded process, this part, but it's also one of the most important, because the final product is going to be based upon what this looks like when you finish. I also hadn't realised at this point that I would want some kind of row of bricks on the top of the wall to finish the wall off. Brick walls don't just normally just end at the top of the wall. They usually have some kind of finish block or something at the top. At least they do where I live. So I got to work and marked out all the upright lines on every other row. I believe this also may be where some of the funny shaped bricks came from, because it was hard to see which row you were on sometimes. I actually marked the incorrect row on occasion. It didn't matter, because you could, if you wanted to, you could remove a brick. So tried holding the tools from different angles just to try to get the lines in the right place. Maybe I should have measured the top row and measured the bottom row, and then just placed a ruler along. Then I could have marked each second one in exactly the right place, but at the time I thought freehanding it would look more natural, which it does. It also looks more wobbly and inconsistent, which, if I was to do it again, I would definitely change that. Also, getting cramp in your hand during the process isn't much fun. Oops, wrong line. Yes, it's trickier than it seems, especially when you've been focusing for a while on the size brick or block. And you're like, no, that doesn't seem right. What have I done wrong here? And then your brain computes, yes, you're on the wrong row, you've done it wrong, so you start again. It's very easy to veer off slightly to the right or slightly to the left as you're working. I positioned it at an angle so that my hand could hold the tool at a comfortable angle, because holding it straight was actually, after a while, quite painful on your wrists. So if you put it at the angle that's natural to your wrist, then you can comfortably make the marks in the foam. And this is literally just making marks. It's not anywhere near going to be the final shape or design of each brick. It's just marking it out. Plus I was more experimenting at this point, because I'd never made it before, anything like this, and wanted to know if it was possible with the tools that I had. Just acrylic paints and paintbrushes for normal paintings. So far it was going quite well. So now I was trying to mark between each brick to make it look like a wall. I've done every second row, so now I had to put the upright in between. And I just work my way along, turning it from, instead of strips, into actual bricks. This was quite a time-consuming part of the procedure, especially with a blank plain wall like this, which is just brick after brick after brick with no variation. If there was a wall or a window, a door in it or something, then that might have given it some kind of variation and broken up the monotony of the same pattern continuing. But as this was a test piece to see what it would look like and if it was possible, I just went with it just for the brick wall to be fairly consistent. And I did discover how difficult it was to keep it consistent. It's very easy to put lines in the wrong place and confuse yourself as to where the next brick goes, and even though it doesn't look like it should be confusing at all. When you've been staring at those kind of small lines and indentations for a long period of time, everything blurs together. But as you get closer to the finish of the design and you can start seeing it coming together, actually it's very satisfying towards the end to see the brick wall emerge from this piece of foam. Hope that's coming across on camera clearly. So, I'm now trying to find different tools. This is a metal ruler that I could try to slide in the grooves to increase the depth, the mortar line as you would call it. I tried various tools. The ruler seemed to be quite handy because it's thin and flat, straight. Because you've already cut into the foam, it guides itself along. But I found it was also very easy to go too deep and mess it up, which, as you slide along, it can get deeper and deeper and deeper, which is very difficult to control. It doesn't really matter how deep it goes, because you're going to fill the gaps anyway, but you don't want to cut right the way through it. But as you can see, the process was slow, but eventually I got a brick wall out of it. And then I went in with my dotting tools and tried to expand some of the gaps between them, especially the corners. I had done uprights and done those freehand. Some of them weren't complete, so some of the bricks weren't finished brick shape, so I got the smallest dotting tool I could find and opened up all those edges around every single brick, and then I wanted to rough the surface of the bricks so they weren't too perfectly smooth looking. I wanted a bit of texture in the surface. Also, I had separated it from the main piece, obviously, as you can see. So I went along roughing up the surface and trying to shape each brick so that the mortar line was more defined between each brick. Now if you want to make your brick wall look really old, you can remove a brick. I've seen people just completely get a pair of pliers or something and grab one of the bricks and pull it out. But I didn't want to do that for my wall. I wanted it to be old, but not so old it was falling apart. But doing this process again was fairly time consuming. But it was fun, because the more you work on it, the more you see it develop and become, from a piece of foam it starts to actually look like a wall, even though it's just plain foam at this point. So once we'd finished that, I had to seal it with a coat of paint. Is the best idea anyway, because you've got to paint, you want to paint it anyway. I want some nice dark background, and that will also seal the foam so that if it were to get wet it wouldn't penetrate into the foam block. It would just run off and wouldn't damage the foam. Also here I'm trying a slightly different technique with my camera. From the previous video I decided I would try to film in manual mode and turn off the autofocus so that it's not focusing constantly and refocusing on the back of my hand or the paintbrush that's closest to the camera. It's now focused, hopefully, directly on the brick wall. Hopefully that will look a lot nicer when you're watching the video back. So here I refocused and didn't quite nail the focus. I think I was trying it by hand, but I started painting each individual brick. Yep. So I just had a very limited palette of colours. A red, a yellow, a brown, a couple of browns, a dark brown and a light brown, and some crimson I think I had, and I just mixed them together with white, black and those few colours, 5 colours, to make all my shades of bricks. I know you can get vastly different coloured bricks, but usually within one wall they're fairly similar colour. But the walls around where I live, I'd been wandering about just checking out the walls and seeing what they looked like, paying more attention than normal because I was working on a wall. And yeah, sometimes even within the same wall there are fairly dramatic differences in colour. One of the colours was actually a gold brown, but after a while of using it I realised it didn't look particularly realistic, not for what I wanted anyway. It looked too gold and I didn't want a golden wall. So I ended up painting over those. At this point I realised it would be better to start on the top left and work my way down and right so that I'm not sticking my hand in bricks that have already been painted. So once I picked a colour, mixed one out of the colours I'd got, I just tried to do a few random spots here and there, random bricks, and build it up that way over time. Make it slightly different shades so they weren't just out of the tube shades, they were slightly modified. I think these were the gold ones which I end up painting over, so I didn't like the gold effect on the bricks. It made them look very weird and not realistic. I love the gold paint, but not on this project. It seemed rather cool to me, I quite liked it. I'd taken some photos of walls around, so I was looking at those for inspirations for colour. Some I was just making up. I did want to make use of all the colours that I had, so it might be a wall with slightly more colours than would be normally seen in one wall, but I just wanted to play with all the colours and scatter them about all over the place. So lots of different coloured bricks. Every single brick painted individually. Thought I'd zoom right in and show you. Painting one brick. And then move a bit so that they're not right next to each other, and paint another one the exact same shade. Then mix the paint a bit, grab some new shade. As you can see, that brick looks a lot smaller than the other two next to it, but it's the final product we're working towards, so hopefully when we get to the end it'll either not be noticeable or it'll just look quite good as it is. Yeah, so some of these bricks are definitely different sizes. If I was to do this again, I would try harder to get them all an even size, which means I wouldn't guesstimate anything. It would be measured and cut to the measurement line rather than estimated, which may have actually helped in the end, we'll see. I think I'm getting a bit of the gold paints coming through in some of these, so I wasn't really cleaning the brush in between them. I was allowing all the colours to merge and make gorgeous brick effects. Some buildings near where I live have very red bricks. The bricks themselves are quite red, and then other buildings are more paler and yellow, like this one. This brick that I'm painting now. I wouldn't normally do them so close together, but while the camera was zoomed in on one spot, I wanted to show it in a bit more detail. This is the part which is quite therapeutic. Just put some music on and paint away each brick. Have your little palette of different colours next to you and mix them as you go, and just put them all over the place so they're not necessarily all next to each other. Make them nice and varied colours. I'm going over the gold ones, I think, here. Trying to progress. And more progress. Some of the walls where I live have this line, several bricks up from the bottom, near to the end, finally, after a long period of brick painting. Nearly the last one. relief that was to finally get to the last brick. Let it all dry, and yes, it looks kind of bright. So here is some salt, and this is quite coarse salt, so I had to use my mortar and pestle and grind it up. I wanted to use a powder as a mortar between the bricks, so I'm going to use a mixture of the salt and the corn flour. The corn flour was nice and smooth and powder texture, like talcum powder. Corn flour might be corn starch where you're from. So I put some in a bowl with the salt, and for a bit of texture and coarseness I wanted the salt to give it a bit of, because the cornstarch is so thin, so pure and smooth. So the salt grinds will be various sizes because they were hand ground, and that should give it some texture once it's applied. Now I'm not going to wetten it and try to grout the bricks that way. It's just going to be mixed together thoroughly so that there's a bit of texture in there. And then take some, literally just sprinkle it on. There it goes. Get it all over so that it goes in all the gaps between each brick, all the nooks and crannies. Anywhere it can go, it will. Hopefully it doesn't go in the texture marks on top of the bricks. I want it to go in the gaps between the bricks. So I dusted it in with a paintbrush, a fairly chunky brush, and very, very lightly just to move it around, as I didn't want to brush out what I'd already put in. And if you press too hard, I was thinking I might accidentally flick out more than I was pushing along. So it was very light. 2 hairs and some air, as the great man once said. So just gently dusting it across. This process will also dull down some of the acrylic, so they won't be so blindingly bright colours. It should mute them slightly. I didn't have any kind of paint set with brick colours, which I'm guessing is out there somewhere. I just had a normal basic cheap sap greens and normal paint colours. I just did the best that I could estimate what a brick colour might be like, and kind of overstated it because it's more fun to have it a bit more vivid. Very gently, just trying to dust that into all the grooves, get it in them all. I might have to do this 2 or 3 times, I don't know. At this point I'm just putting it on and dusting it off again, hoping that I can retain enough of it within the gaps to act as mortar. Some of the grains of salt weren't crushed quite small enough and became a little bit of a problem. Just trying different ways of brushing it on to stop it from just coming back out, but I want it in the gaps and not really on top of the bricks, so I had to try and figure out how to do that, how to get it to come off the main surface. If I was going to do it again, I would probably use blue tack to stick the thing down so that you could put a bit of pressure behind it when you're moving and not worry about the whole thing just sliding around. I should have stuck it down with a piece of blue tack before I started. So at this point I'm just going really gently over the surface, trying to remove it from the surface of the bricks, from the textural markings I put in. I could have left it flat and smooth and then done the textural markings after this process, but it wouldn't have made any difference. At least I don't think it would have. It's a thought to try at a later date. So just gently brushing it all off. Now the next procedure is to try to stop it from falling out whenever you move the wall. So you need some way to seal it in. And the way you do that is water down. I used a 50-50 mix of just white craft glue, whatever you can get, basic white craft glue. Mix that with some water to make it pretty runny, pretty thin. If your craft glue is already fairly thin, you might not need a 50-50 mix. But first of all, I was just making sure every little spot that I needed it in was actually filled. Anywhere I thought needed a bit extra. Beautiful. I think we're ready to seal it in now. Fairly pleased with the result. It's a bit more colourful than a wall would normally be, but it's the concept that I was testing out to see if it was possible. So here's the watered down. I tried this idea I thought of with using a tube, putting your finger over the end of the tube to hold a certain amount of liquid in and then dripping it on. But I don't know, it was just taking a very long time because I didn't want to push out the water that I'd put in. So I tried that, and then I tried just, in the end I just went with a paintbrush. I assumed that I would just push it out with a paintbrush, but actually as long as you just break the surface tension, it runs between the gaps naturally by itself. So the brush was just pushing the liquid around the surface and it was finding its own way in. I was hoping it wouldn't dissolve the salt that I put in for some texture, but I think it will dry and seal before it dissolves anything, and that's how the brick wall nicely sealed. So as it goes on, it kind of looks more real in a way. I was very pleased with the result as it was going. It was giving me more confidence to continue. Very pleased. The whole process should make it look a little bit more muted from the colours and bring them down to a more realistic level. nice to see it all coming together and looking actually like a wall, strangely enough. So I wasn't convinced it would actually work. But as the liquid was going on, obviously with it very, very wet like this, it's going to take a lot longer to dry. The previous layers actually dried surprisingly quick because the bricks to paint themselves were so small that they did dry very quickly. And a small USB fan I plugged in, placed it by the window and just let it go. Within 10 minutes it was dry. But this whole wet layer is gonna need a bit longer to dry, maybe possibly even overnight. Which isn't much fun when you're in the mood for art and you want to get on with it. You don't really want to be waiting. So I got that painted on. I thought I might have to do it again once it's dry. But I'd mixed up a considerable amount of the corn starch and salt combination. So here I'm just dabbing the surface very lightly, not to pull out the mortar, but just to dry the surface of the bricks, so that when it dries they don't dry too white, which worked somewhat. It's at this point I could have done the texturing of the surface, which may have stopped some of the areas from being white in the middle faces of each brick. So I found a kebab stick that had a brick shaped handle. I had to carve it down slightly to get it accurately one brick sized, but I wanted to push some of the bricks in a little bit to make them all a different sizes so they're not all smooth flat to the surface. And I was surprised at just how much force you had to press to get it to slightly cave in, and if you pressed with too much force it was very easy to completely crush it right the way in, so I was being very careful. If you notice at this point there is also another piece of wall that I'd cut off with the other strip and added to the top, because I wanted kind of a proper top to my wall. So I added some bricks going away from us, forward back, along the top of the wall, just to give it some kind of finish for the top. Just trying to indent these bricks without pushing them all the way through. It was harder than it looked because it either didn't move at all or it suddenly went flying in. Oh wow. And I didn't want a big hole in my wall. So I gave up on that. I had changed a few of them, made them look slightly different, and now I just wanted to add some mold, mildew, fungus, and mossy patches. So for this I used a watercolour paint, which I knew would not be too overpowering, would hopefully fade out as it dried, so it wouldn't be too bold. It might look quite shocking when it goes on, but it will fade out. So I'm just getting some white, because sometimes the lime comes out of the bricks or the mortar and can run down the wall a bit, staining some of the bricks. And I knew that this would go on looking quite strong and hopefully would fade a bit as it dried. Or maybe I could have washed over it with a watery wash to make it fade a bit more or spread out a bit more, but I just wanted to see what it would do, if it would work. Just add an element of something that I'd seen on the walls around my hometown. I'm not sure if it's adding any realism, but it's adding some details to what is otherwise just a plain wall, so I figured it would help. Some of the walls around where I live and that I've seen have one brick the same colour running along through it, either near the top of the wall or the bottom, and that's a common theme I've seen. I don't know if that's common in other countries, so I tried to recreate that on this wall. It's not standing out so much at the moment, but hopefully when it's finished it will. I was starting to get the technique right and getting it how I wanted, but at this point it was too late, the others had already dried. So I just went with it, and then I decided to put a bit of graffiti on my wall. Mix it up so it's a slightly off reddish colour. Some annoying guy called Marco came and graffitied on the wall. What an annoying character. I added a little bit of it to make it look like, it wasn't too old, but at least old enough to make it look like it had faded a bit over time, so it wasn't like only just been graffitied yesterday. So a little bit of the paint or ink was running down the wall slightly underneath. Oh, we got some greens, started putting them along the bottom sides of the wall. Very common where I live to see moss growing up the wall, usually at the bottom edges, sometimes right up the side of a wall, and occasionally on the top of a wall you'll get little mossy patches. I live next to a stream, so quite a lot of walls do get damp from the air. They will have. So I mixed up several different greens, some very, very pale light greens and some darker green. I want to be too liberal with the dark green because it was quite overpowering. I wasn't sure if it would dry much darker or much lighter, so I didn't want to put too much of it on. wanted some in some places, mainly up the side of the wall and along the bottom. If you were making a wall in a diorama or something, you could definitely add grasses and things in front of it anyway, so that would give it that illusion of moss and stuff growing up the wall. But I wanted to try the technique I used on the other wall, on the dry stone walling. So I let that dry. And then I got some, I was trying to flick little dots, but it wasn't working. Little dots of green, but it wasn't really having any effect. So I wanted little dots of glue for the same effect as I did on the other wall. But that was a vain attempt. The glue was either too thick or the droplets were so small they wouldn't have stuck anything. So I went with an old brush, which was kind of, didn't matter to me if it was damaged or not. I wanted it to be kind of spidery shaped brush, so squish the edge, the end. So it's got to be an old brush, you don't want to ruin a new one. So you have it sort of splaying out in all different directions, and dip that in the glue and try to dab little speckles of glue everywhere. But the glue was just too thick for that, so it wouldn't have worked anyway. Here I'm just trying to dull down some of the graffiti and the green that I added. I figured it was a bit too bright. Even after it dried, it seemed a tad too bright. I wanted to dull it down, so I used a bit more of the powder, with the intention that when I'm done I'll use some kind of spray sealant when I'm completely finished with the wall. But just adding some of this to it and then dusting it off is enough to just mute the colours a touch, so they're not so bright and obvious. Give it a good dusting off. You can see from this angle just how flat the wall is. If I was going to make this again, I would like to make a lot more rough surface, a lot more squashed bricks, raised bricks. And definitely some kind of window or doorway or something in it, just to give it some reason for being, rather than just a wall. But as I say, this was just a concept to see if it would work. I wasn't even sure I could pull it off, but I'm quite pleased with the results so far. And now I'm going to do my parsley moss trick. Grind some up to moss size, use my ruined brush, dip it in the glue, and hopefully get some little speckles of glue, which did not work whatsoever, and the glue just went on fairly thick anyway. I could have watered the glue down, I guess, but no, I just went with it. It wanted to go like that, so that's how it was going. I just went over the areas I'd already painted green. Figured I'd make them look a little bit more mossy by actually adding some moss. Well, parsley, but it looks like moss-ish. And you could paint over it, and once it's sealed as well, I think it will be fine. I don't think it's going to go off. But if it does go off and go mouldy, at least it will add to the colour. But I don't think it will. So there we go, tip all that on, allow that to dry, and tip off the excess. I decided I needed a bit more, wasn't generous enough with the first lot. It really does not need much crushing before it gets to a very fine powder, so tip that off, and voila, a wall. There's one big piece in there. And just set it to dry for as long as it takes, and then knock off the excess. And if you want to paint over it, you can paint over the parsley, give it a bit more texture, or you could paint it and then grind it and then put it on if you wanted a much more realistic look. But I didn't want to buy an ingredient that was designed to look like moss. I wanted to use something that most people would have. So the only thing you'd really need to buy would be a piece of this foam, and most people have got everything you need to have a go at making a wall. You've probably got paints, and you've probably got brushes and little tools for making little brick shapes. Doesn't matter what you use. Toothpicks, dinner knives, anything should work. Just use an old one that you don't need anymore. And I'd painted all the tops. I did that off camera, and the sides. I didn't want to bore you with the edges and the tops, but I did paint them, the sides. I didn't paint the back or the bottom. And there it is, the finished item. Hope you enjoyed, and see you in the next.